I think you've heard something quite remarkable in the last 2 days. It is a great pleasure to invite my very colleague, Rabbi Daniel Chorny, to give the teaching for today.
And thank you all for bringing my word stuff. Thank God, after so many years of doing this Jewish stuff, I'm pretty good at it. Thank God. So as I was preparing for today, I fell victim to this disease that I have, which is I find that I always want to preface and caution and give preamble before I speak. And I just want you to know all the mistakes that I'm about to make are all my own and not of the people who we're going to be reading. Okay. So the first thing I want to mention is, who here is familiar with the humoral theory of temperaments? Okay, so some of us may know about it. In the ancient world and in the Middle Ages, there's this idea that health was a matter of the balancing of the humors. And these humors were blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Okay? It's very complicated, it's very specific, but the point is, each of these elements were seen to be in a harmony or a balance in every person. And if one of these things got out of whack, you would be said to be ill in some way, shape, or another. Additionally, each of these humors is associated with an archetype of personality or temperament. So you might see this archetype replicated in other parts of culture. So who's a big fan of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles? Okay, so aside from being my introduction to the names of great Renaissance artists, each of the Ninja Turtles corresponds to one of these numeric temperaments, and I'll let you decide which one you're with, which. So just, to share, if you are said to have a lot of blood in you, then you're said to be sanguine, as from the Latin word sanguine, right? Or if you had too much yellow bile, you were said to be choleric, C-H-O-L-E-R-I-C, which I guess means like depressive or, bit of an Eeyore type of personality. Oh, that's another archetype. Black bile, which I've never seen. If you have an excess of that, you'd be considered to be melancholic, practical, pragmatic, realistic. And finally, phlegmatic, which sounds much worse than what it is. Someone who has a lot of phlegm. And that person said be good-natured and benevolent and kind. Okay, so they're not necessarily pejoratives, but they're a way for organizing how we see ourselves and how we see people. And of course, these things get replicated in every generation. Who is Samantha? Right? Who's does anyone know the names of the characters next in the city?
Oh,
Carrie, Samantha, Charlotte, and Miranda. So some people have theorized that these four are also based on these archetypes. And I'll let you decide which are which. Now, why am I telling you about all these archetypes? Because I want to dig into an element of our tradition that was discovered really in the modern period and has since been moved forward to a different stage of its development. And before I do that, I want to share the one joke that I really got right on this sheet. Next time someone asks you at a cafe or at a bar or something, what's your sign? You can answer them with a full good humor and say, oh, I don't believe in astrology. What's your humor? I only date phlegmatic people. Are you phlegmatic? Okay, so you may be aware that there is a hypothesis of the authorship of Torah. Okay, and that hypothesis is known widely as the documentary hypothesis. So if this is new to you, great. I'll explain more about it later, but in essence, we can identify certain documents or certain voices that have been smooshed together by some editor that became our Torah. And this is very controversial in the very beginnings of things because the idea that the Torah came from anywhere but God's mouth on Mount Sinai was very controversial. And thank God we've moved to the other end of that. So it's not so controversial today, but the controversy now is, do these categories really hold up? So I think of the Torah as a constitution. I think of it as something that was written by a committee over the centuries. I used to joke around that I was going to find like an acronym for MOSES to be like, the cabal of people who came up with the Torah. My favorite ones that I found in an acronym generator were Mosaic Office of Scribes for Emancipation of Souls. That's a pretty good one. Or Magisterial Organization for the Salvation of Excellent Sapiens. Not bad, not bad. So we're going to look at four biblical temperaments, four biblical personalities, as is theorized through this lens of documentary hypothesis. So you may have gotten really nervous when you saw me with all these papers in front of me. I'd like to enlist a couple of volunteers, if I can, to help me pass these around. They are not identical sheets. So I need everyone to divide up in about 4 groups. So roughly where Matt is sitting back, on that side will be group. And roughly where Kendrick Ken is sitting forward on this side will be group. And roughly at the same level on this side and that side. Does that make sense? Okay. And I'm not going to pick which document everyone gets. I'm just going to randomly hand them out different sections. But if you are a particularly good reader of Hebrew, I suggest that you get in the section with the E source. So I'm going to give the E source over to a side that I think will really enjoy it. Let's see, Kendrick Ken, you're a ringer on this one. I know. And on this side, I think we're going to go with the P source. And if we had kids here, we'd be very, very inundated with laughter. And over here, we're going to go with the J source. And over here, we're going to go with the R source. Oh, the core source. Thank you. Got it. Okay. So I labeled these sources J, E, P, and R. And maybe ask you, what about G? And Deuteronomy. And the truth is, we don't care about Deuteronomy until much later in the story. So we're going to stick to the Yahwist, that's J, the Elohist, that's E, the priestly source, that's P, and the redactor layer, that's the R. Now, I want you guys to take a moment in your quadrants, and if you're not in a quadrant, please go in a quadrant. I believe you have plenty of copies. And I want you to focus on the side that's not colorized. The side that's not colorized, okay? So each of those is going to contain the source that the documentary hypothesis as of today believes is the breakdown of that source. And at the bottom, there are 3 or 4 questions for you to discuss in your groups. And please, please, please be mindful. You need to either volunteer yourself or volunteer someone in your group to be ready to report back. Okay, so it's way too quiet in here. So I need a little bit of chaos for about 5 minutes. So and go. So I wanna first commend you all on everyone jumping into this journey with me. I know that it's not always easy, and it's not, people don't always come to this without expecting but I'm glad you all jumped in with it. Before we get into sharing, I want to sort of mention that we have just engaged in a practice that's very, very Jewish. Okay, and it may not be Jewish for the reasons you think. In the Middle Ages, we had a sage by the name of Rashi. Well, we called him Rashi. His name was Rabbi Shlomo ben Yitzhaki, and he's famously the most important commentator on the Torah that we have. Usually, a standard Torah book will have him in the inner margin along with other commentaries, but he's usually the number 1. And he argued that sometimes his interpretation of the plain meanings of the text, that is what you understand just from knowing how to read the words, departs dramatically from Jewish practice and Jewish tradition. And so we understand that we cannot understand this text fully for how we live our lives on its own. We have the oral law to help us along with that, but yet the phrases, the text never departs fully from the pshat, from the plain meaning, which means that there's still depths to be plumbed there. In the next iteration of this development, his grandson, by the name of Rash, who's known as Rashbam, took Rashi's methodology and kicked it up a notch And he actually was very happy to say that there's lots of stuff in the Torah that counters what Jewish practice is today, and yet it's okay to study Torah for its plain meaning and to live it with our sages' advice. And he used to refer to the author as, he actually referred to Moses as the author. He believed that Moses was making editorial choices when he was getting the Torah. And then the next logical step in the progression is actually some kind of editorial there is happening here, and there's clearly many voices at play. So before I start describing all of these four different, let's say, biblical temperaments, let's share around and see what people have uncovered. So we're just going to go in the order of what people believe is the chronological development of the text. So let's go to the e-source. Who has the e-source? Yes.
So they've nominated me. So basically, what stood out to us about this was that it was like very kind of was speaking about something that's for what we feel emotionally a very emotionally intense kind of topic, but it's spoken about in a very kind of methodical way, and it focuses on the logistics of like what was brought, what they did, and things like that. There's no kind of mention of any emotion or feeling. And like essentially it deals with, we noted that Isaac just completely follows his father, and Abraham completely just follows God. And they do this very kind of difficult thing, or they're doing this difficult thing. They just kind of do it, and it's kind of just focusing on like the logistics of it. And we said that we were thinking that they were attracted to it because it kind of talks about that like element of faith or surrender, and also that element of kind of redemption that
Excellent. That is excellent. So if you need to a little bit of a reference on the colorized side, the e-source is what's visible in blue. Okay? This is the core of what we read today, the second day of Rosh Hashanah. And as you said, it's just the facts, right? It's kids. It's keep it stupid, silly. Sorry, no, keep it simple, stupid. Sorry, I'm silly. And you're right. It's very much. This is what they did. It's a story. It's these legends of our people. By the way, for those of you who are playing at home, the e-source is often marked by the use of the name Elohim for God, and only rarely does it use the tetragrammaton in later sources after God reveals God's name to Moses. Because if you remember further on, God says to Moses, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob knew me by the name El Shaddai or something like that, and I'm going to reveal to you my actual name. And so from then on, it gets a little bit more murky about who's doing what. Right. So this is the basic story. This is details. But question: what happens to Isaac at the end of the story? According to E.
He disappears.
He doesn't die.
He disappears.
He disappears. He's no longer in the story. And in fact, according to this understanding of the sources, the drama just dropped off.
Yeah.
Right? We don't know what happened to Isaac. According to Rabbi Dr. Tzemach Yore, who is he's a humanistic rabbi, he believes that according to the original sourcing, Isaac is sacrificed. Isaac dies. And thankfully, someone didn't like this. And so they decided to edit it into something new, something a little bit more meaningful. So real quick, why do you think, if you only had this source, why do you think this source would be appropriate for Rosh Hashanah? And it doesn't have to be the same person speaking, by the way. I appreciate it. Huh? That's a great question. There's a lot of theories that Isaac is sort of a made-up character as a sort of connective tissue between generations, but really he's not much of an actor. Everything he does in the text is a replication of what his father did, right? He doesn't have real agency in almost any moment of his life, but we need him to get to Jacob. Okay? In fact, if you want to know a powerful, or ancestor, his wife, Rebecca, is more like Abraham than Isaac is. And you can see that from the source material. So we'll get to that in another part. So now, thank you so much for sharing. I know that that e-source is big. If you're following on again, we're on the polarized side. Now let's go to the next layer of analysis. And for this one, I kind of may have cheated a little bit. So let's go to the J source. And when I say let's go to the J source, and I cheated a little bit because I actually took some of yesterday's Torah reading, because J does not show up in today's Torah reading, but I wanted to share their words here. So J is known as the Yahwehs, which means that primarily the name they use for God is the Tetragrammaton, the Yud Pei Vav Pei name, which we don't know how to pronounce. And so who has the J source? You guys over there?
Yeah, read it.
You guys over there, okay? So representative, tell us a little bit about what you did. Oh, wow. I want to hear your title again, okay? You guys can move the title. Not the title?
We did.
Okay. Okay, J source, what you got?
So it seems to me it's pretty straightforward accounting of the generations who came after Abraham. After Abraham has not sacrificed or potentially sacrificed Isaac, and God promises to Abraham that people will be as the stars. Abraham couldn't be too hopeful. His banished Hagar and the sons disappeared. So here is a moment of hope saying that you do have generations that will go forward.
Great. If you look in the Torah, in the Talmud, in Masechet Megillah, they say the reason that the entire reason for selecting that Torah portion for Rosh Hashanah is for that last paragraph at the bottom here. It's almost like they were thinking, well, we want to tell this part, but it doesn't make sense unless we tell this part, and so let's tell everything in between as well. But according to that, the hope of having a future, the hope of having continuity, that is ultimately the message that we get from the J source in this case. Again, no action almost at all. It's entirely, and Sarah, and God remembered Sarah, as God said. Okay? This is emphasizing God's personal connection to human beings and God's faithfulness to what God has said. So when God said something, God fulfilled, according to this author. As opposed to the E source that doesn't see this God as a very personal being. This is more of a commanding force in our universe. And what that source demands is obedience and fear of heaven. And there's no fear involved with the J source. Right? God is the God that remembers you, the God that comforts you, the God that gives you hope that there's going to be a tomorrow, even though we know from David Hume that that's not a given. So thank you very much. So you guys come up with a title for your source?
Like a family tree. God plants a family tree.
Nice. The Holy Family Tree. Excellent. Okay, I know that I'm going a bit long. I apologize, but I hope this is engaging. Let's see, J, we got E, J, P. Let's go to P, the priestly source. Now, if you want the big chunk of the priestly source, you got to go to the first chapter of Genesis, the chapters regarding Noah and the flood, and then the book of Vayikra and some of the Midbar. So this guy, very, very late addition to the Torah text, and at least according to a few scholars that I've heard, there's a theory that the P source is actually the interpolation of Ezra the scribe. Ezra the scribe was the high priest of the day, appointed through a covenant, a brit, with the king of Persia to allow the reestablishment of the people of Israel in the land. And so he covers over a lot of things that are there to teach us not to repeat the mistakes that we made in the past. He's a bit OCD, not gonna lie. He loves lists. He loves excruciating detail for constructing the tabernacle and all these different things. And all of this is to say, if you don't keep God's covenant, we might end up exiling him. And lo and behold, he was right. So who's got the P source for us? I believe it's over here. Okay. Who wants to speak? Or who's being appointed to speak? Yes.
Well, I was gonna say, there seems to be a lot of covenantal purpose in this, because like God keeping his promise, Sarah, keeping his promise to Abraham, like after time that he said he would, and then also like his mentioning, the circumcision of Isaac, like that. What you were saying.
Yeah. He loves ritual. He loves rite, loves circumcision, all these things that make us unique and that separate us from other peoples. Ezra the scribe was famous or infamous for having all of the people who came back under the control of Jewish, tradition, expel their non-Jewish wives. He was very concerned with intermarriage. Thank God we evolved a little bit with that. But really, it's very much, this is us, we do this, and please don't mess it up, otherwise bad things may happen. And finally, we have the R source. R is for redactor. Someone who it's believed had sort of a final loss on the thing before getting to the present, as it were. So R source all the way in the back.
Okay.
Oh, by the way, is there a title for you guys? No? P. Hayes.
Oh, no, he was asking if there's a title for P.
Sorry,
He was asking if there's a title for P.
if there's
Or
A title for P.
title for P, yeah, no, they said no.
Okay, all right. Then, so for the R source, you kind of got this little vignette about at the last minute, wait, don't sacrifice him. And we thought that particularly he seemed concerned with awe, and he seemed very concerned with God's motivation, but almost not at all concerned with Abraham's internal state. This is a story about what God was thinking, and in a way making God look better than what the story might have otherwise been. Did I miss anything?
Well, we said that, with the focus on the awe here, right? We are in the days of awe, right? So there may be that connection that in a way, Abraham was either at a very high place or a very low place, depending how you want to see this. But whatever it was his awe or fear of God, depending how you want to translate that, which must have created this intense moment in his life, just as we are supposed to have this intense moment of our life right now in these days.
Great. And do you guys have a title for the R sources view?
We called it the annealer.
The what?
The annealer.
The annealer. You're gonna have to define that for me.
When you're working with a glass or an amorphous material, it doesn't go to its ground state. It gets stuck in a higher level state, a higher energy state, and then there's a hill in the energy landscape, so it can't get to a lower state. And the way you make it stronger is you put a little energy in, you heat it, and then cool it very slowly. And that can allow it to get to a more harmonious state. So
You can
you
bring eggs for a soup or something.
do you temper eggs?
Dude, depends on the recipe.
Okay.
But I learned something today. Thank you so much for sharing that. The annealer. That's awesome.
Well, basically, this saved the story for us. That little insert, because again, if we take that green stuff out, we end up with a very devastating. I mean, by green, I mean in the text, the chunk that is our the reductor. Yeah. If you take that out, then you get that story where all of a sudden Isaac no longer appears. And so in order to bring this however you want to see that, adapted to new realities in society or simply to a change in the psyche of the Israelites. You put that in there and you make it a story of redemption, if you will, rather than a story of now that you've killed your son, you're truly mine, you know?
Good. So thank you so much for sharing. I'm just gonna bring us home now that we're getting to, we're way over time, I apologize. The R source is very, 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 very anti-direct communication with God. So if you look at there, it's not God speaking, it's God's messenger speaking. So there's this idea that later in history, the redactor level of things was just very uncomfortable with the idea that God would speak directly to human beings, go figure, and not a very new idea. And so often they will add a creature or an angel or some kind of messenger to speak God's word. I happen to believe that the burning bush is also possibly influenced by this, because we have this idea that the fire of the Akedah does not consume the boy because they're going to burning him, but yet we have the fire that God speaks to Moses through. Anyways, I'm ready.
I never thought of that before. Oh, that's good, yeah. It's more, there's the intermediary in a sense. And usually we don't, in Judaism, we don't have these like intermediary, except for the beginning.
Right, but we're not talking about a human being. We're not talking about someone who is taking instructions for God. It's someone who is so accustomed to the idea that Abraham could perceive God's voice that they put God's words into the mouth of a lesser being.
It would be too much for human being, the physicality of this body.
Like Alanis Morris said in Dogma, where you open your mouth and everyone's heads explode.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay,
Yeah?
all right.
You bring the theory, I bring the ridiculous example.
No, I think.
Cool. So getting back to the topic at hand. We don't know why the Akedah was really chosen for this Rosh Hashanah. I looked into this and the Talmud doesn't say it. It says, we read this on Rosh Hashanah. And I did some digging, and the only thing close to an explanation I found from the Mishnah of Brura, who was Israel Meir Kagan, who was a 20th century rabbi. Well, he was born in 1875 and he died in 1905. He's famous for his work on Lashon Hara, called Shmirat HaLashon. He's also known as the Focus Chaim. So all these different words that people use for this guy, the same guy, really, really interesting person. And he writes in the relevant section of his commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, the seminal code of Jewish law. He writes, "We read this in order to recall the merits of the binding of Isaac." And I'm deeply dissatisfied with that. So I'm not going to give you the answer. Right? It's left open for you to figure out what is it that which messages are you needing to hear on this high holidays, right? Because after all, we did not excise anyone that we know of from text. We allowed the voices that are more comfortable or less comfortable or odd or bizarre to remain there, because, and this is my personal belief, whoever was involved in the final redaction of our Torah cared deeply that we all find a voice to connect to, all find a place to plug in and step up into this very complicated and very multiple text. So my blessing to you on this Rosh Hashanah is that you have many opportunities to study and to wax poetic and expound upon words of Torah, whether you choose a small chunk from one potential author, or you choose large swaths of it to think of it as a single cohesive unit. Every layer of analysis is Torah. Every possible way to interpret it is allowed. It is encouraged. And once you've learned something new, I hope you'll come back and teach us more about it.
And I'll say one thing, and I'm not saying anything for the rest of the day.
none of this contradicts the divine origin of the Torah, okay? So I happen to absolutely accept the documentary hypothesis, and I also believe that it was dictated to Moshe at Sinai. It's very metaphorically. But that's what he is. It's a very turning point.
Thank you, Rabbi Chorny, for a beautiful and very well thought out teaching.